But I remember very well back in 2008, the Greenpeace publication. This was in a magazine in those days, of course, not on the internet. It was called Turning Up the Heat, Global Warming and the Degradation of Canada's Boreal Forest. In the article, they coined the term the Boreal carbon bomb. And we're literally looking at this carbon bomb now going off because next year, probably we will be told how much CO2 this emitted. It's going to be a vast, vast amount.
Welcome to the Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I'm your host today with regular guests, Peter and Paul. Today, Canada on fire. By now, most of you have heard about the terribly, terribly tragic fires in Canada. It is a fire, or shall I say fires of devastating proportions. And we'll speak later to the significance of these fires and what they're doing to the boreal forests and what that means for the forests in Canada and actually in Siberia and for all of us, for the future of humanity and for the future of those living beings that call this wonderful forest their home. So what's been going on is really just incredible. And I want to state that I do live in New York City, so I will speak to what my experience has been in New York City. But I also want to temper that with the fact, and this has been brought up on various periodicals and news magazines, that people are finally starting to get it. People here in New York City, oh God, it was so strange. It was almost like the early days of the pandemic all over again. You know, everyone had their masks on. I shouldn't say everyone. A lot of people did. It should have been everyone. The messaging did not get out as it should have as to the dangers of this particular matter that was just flooding our city, changing the sky from an orange to an eerie brownish color. I often get to work from home, and I had to say that even though I have beautiful light facing the west here in my apartment, for which I'm very grateful, I had to have my overhead lights on because it was so dark in my apartment, so incredibly dark. So I want to say that the health effects of these fires are just terrible to anyone who breathes. They're also very bad for the environment. And there are so many other factors that we have to speak on. But I do want to mention those in many parts of the world, China, India, who live with such bad air quality on a daily basis. So while this was an exception for us, it's not for many people. And I think it's really important that that gets mentioned. You know, New York City is unique in that we have a lot of our city is sustained by the arts and everything that goes around it, such as bars and restaurants. I was really surprised that a lot of Broadway shows, including Hamilton, had to shut down because of the unhealthy smoke levels. I have a friend who is playing an instrument for the musical Camelot. His show got canceled. Many of these performers, depending on their union status, lost a day's pay. And for some of these artists who are struggling, that's significant. For the people who came into town to see shows, if they were leaving within the next few days, they're not going to get to see the show that they may have bought a ticket for months in advance. There was one performer who, after 10 minutes of being on the stage, literally had to walk off the stage because she couldn't breathe. So much for the show must go on. So I just want to say that Broadway in 2019, there were close to 15 million people who attended Broadway shows. And the ticket gross sales was close to $2 billion. And Broadway in general contributes almost $15 billion to the economy here in New York City. and it supports almost up to 100,000 jobs. Why am I mentioning Broadway when the boreal forests are burning? Because climate change will affect every aspect of our lives. This is a story that continues to get lost, and that is incredibly important. It's not just the forests or the oceans or the animals. It is every aspect of our life that will be affected. I want to turn it over to Paul and hear what he has to say. I know you've been speaking a lot about these fires, Paul, and then you're also in Canada. So please share with us your thoughts.
Thank you. So a lot of Canada has had a record warm spring and very, very dry conditions. So the heat, it sets nearly an 84-year record. The records go back in reanalysis, climate reanalysis, about 84 years. Large parts of northern Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, that region is record dry, also parts of Quebec and eastern Ontario. So very little rain and very, very warm temperatures for the spring. And we had quite a bit of snow, so there was quite a bit of water around in the melt. In fact, parts of the Ottawa River were flooding. It was the third worst year for flooding, second or third worst. So there was a lot of water around, and that triggers a lot of early growth of vegetation. Also, there was an ice storm in the beginning of April, which brought down a lot of branches and trees, both in Ontario and Quebec. Quebec was worse. And in fact, those branches and trees knocked out power to 1.2 million people in Quebec just over a month ago. So all that wood is lying on the ground and exposed to very warm temperatures, very dry conditions. So it becomes perfect fuel for fires. Now, for every degree Celsius increase in warming, there's 12% more lightning strikes. Okay, so lots of lightning in the storms, and the conditions were just primed in Canada for these fires. So it started out west in Alberta, and then it moved to and BC a bit, and then it moved to the east coast to Nova Scotia. We had very unusual fires there, right near Halifax. One big fire took out 200 structures, 200 homes. And then it was Quebec's turn, and so record numbers of fires in Quebec. And I think a few days ago, the number of fires in Canada peaked at about 440 or so, about 150 alone in Quebec. And of the ones in Quebec, 110 were out of control. One of the problems with fighting fires is, if there's so many, you do triage and you kind of do the ones that are going to be threatening cities or structures and let other ones just kind of burn and get larger and larger. You don't do too much for them. So all of these things happened. Also, there was because the jet stream is much slower and wavier because of the greatly warming Arctic, then there was a very strong low pressure area off the eastern seaboard. When you have a very strong low pressure area, the air coming into it deflects to the right in the northern hemisphere, so you set up a counterclockwise air circulation pattern. So the west side of that low, the air is moving from the north to south. So that air picked up the smoke from the fires in northern Quebec and brought them to Ottawa. So we had two extremely bad days. I'm sure it's record bad air quality in Ottawa. Two really, really bad days. In fact, the air quality index was over 500. You can look at the air quality index around the world and see, well, we had it very, very high for a period of time because of the wildfires. But as you mentioned, cities in India and China, some of them have this day in, day out. And I'm sure people's lives are shortened by up to 10 years in those countries. The very worst thing is the PM 2.5 or particulate matter 2.5 particles, the very, very small particles. The air quality index depends on the PM 2.5 concentration, ozone concentration, and nitrogen dioxide concentration. So in Ottawa, the PM 2.5 count was 511 micrograms per cubic meter. The day after, when the winds didn't draw the fire over Ottawa, we were down to 3. Okay, so in other words, the PM 2.5 went up a factor of 170 times above normal. It's very dangerous because it's very small particles. They can get right into the lungs, into the alveoli, and they can actually get into the bloodstream. So when they're in the bloodstream, they can then cause inflammation throughout your body. They've been detected in the brain. They've been detected in fetuses getting through the placental barrier. They've been detected in reproductive organs. So very, very unhealthy, huge cardiovascular problems and things like that. So these fires are basically over 4 million hectares have burned in Canada. That's about 10 million acres. Normally for this time of year, you'd have about a factor of 20 times less area burned. So this is a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, really, thank you so much for bringing up those health impacts, Paul. I mean, I too wanted to bring that up as well. And this is why there's kind of been like an international cry of hypocrisy towards people in New York, because as you mentioned, people in India and China live much, significantly shorter lives due to the air pollution. And here we are in New York complaining about a few days of terrible air. But I think it's important, yes, to point out the hypocrisy, but actually, rather than hypocrisy, it's ignorance. People just have never experienced this. Some of the health impacts that you pointed out, I want to add on, of course, premature death, heart attacks, strokes. It aggravates asthma for those who have it. And of course, decreases lung function. But it's, the human body is an organism. But I want to point out that the planet is also a living organism. And the planet also suffers with with this horrible air and the PM 2.5. And some of the things that our planet organism suffers is it makes lakes and streams more acidic. It depletes nutrients in soil. It affects the diversity of ecosystems, and it contributes to acid rain effects. So it affects all living beings, including our planet. It's really just, there's nothing good that can be said about it. One of the things that I liked hearing you say, I don't know if I've ever heard this the way that you stated it, that the degree to which the warming of the planet increases the lightning strikes, which of course can be a factor in these forest fires. I don't know how many of you in our audience knew that. Now that tidbit of information is yours. You can use it. I always find it so helpful to be edified regarding these topics of climate change. So please, if you're learning something, hit that like button. It helps us with the algorithm. And if you haven't, take this opportunity to subscribe, because we would love to have you with us, not for this show, but for each and every show that we have. I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who's also lives in Canada, on the other side of Canada. I want to hear your thoughts, Peter, on this terrible tragedy of the boreal forests.
So, yeah, we've been watching this every day, all through the day. The images that we're getting of these dense air pollution in the American cities. I don't know. Have we ever seen anything like that before? All of these cities, and you can hardly see across the streets almost. Fossil fuel dystopia is what I would call it. This is being brought to us and our future by the fossil fuel industry. The connection is very, very clear. Now, one of the things that myself and Paul and other colleagues for many, many years have been highly concerned about is the very worst single impact of global surface warming, and that is feedbacks. That is amplifying feedbacks, whereby the warmed up planet starts to emit its own extra greenhouse gases. We had always anticipated that the world would never allow the situation to deteriorate in which these feedbacks were triggered. Well, here we are today, and we're looking at a massive feedback with the burning of the boreal forest. The amount of CO2 from these forests, not before. There's nothing been like the size of this fire in the boreal, but the CO2 emissions have been as much as several small countries in Europe, for example. So very, very high. So the CO2 this year is gonna just go through the roof. Now, NASA, I was looking at a map that NASA and NOAA published from their satellites of the smoke, in which they said that most of North America, this was yesterday, is covered by smoke. That's unbelievable, right? I mean, did any of us ever imagine that anything like that could be allowed to happen? Well, it's not only being allowed to happen, it's being made to happen by our fossil fuel corporations, by the big banks that finance them, and by our governments who support them and subsidize them. So we're looking at North America and Siberia, the biggest forest in the world, that holds double the carbon of all the rainforests combined. We're looking at that burning. That is a huge, huge feedback. And at the same time, we know that we've got another feedback occurring actually within the boreal forests, which is the wetlands, because there's about 1 million lakes up in Canada's boreal. Canada's boreal absolutely vast. And then, thanks for mentioning the wildlife, the boreal is a very essential habitat for countless migratory birds, but of course all kinds of other wildlife. They will be incinerated and losing their homes. And this really is an apocalyptic situation. This is really dystopia that we're looking at. I look at the NASA firm's fire maps frequently, and I'm always looking for the boreal. Up to this year, the boreal in Siberia has been burning slowly, worse and worse and worse. There has not been much burning of the boreal in Canada. This year, that's completely changed. A very large proportion of the boreal in Canada is burning. There's about probably 60 fires of 1,000 acre in size. NASA firms will point this out. But Siberia is in a historic heat wave. That's been reported from Siberia. And the central aspect of the Great Boreal Forest in Siberia is practically all burning. I've never, ever seen anything like this in Siberia. Nothing to compare with this. So the boreal forest is a cold-adapted forest, and it has been drying. That's been recorded, drying out. The scientists, of course, have been concerned about that. At the same time, there have been more fires. As I say, not many on a large scale in northern Canada, but of course, that has changed. I've been talking about a grim future. We're looking at a very, very uncertain future now. I imagine that there will be little or no response to this at all, apart from, waiting for it all to clear up. And then this is one of many planetary emergency situations which is totally out of control. So you talk about large fires out of control. This is a whole carbon retaining system which is out of control. The boreal forest is our biggest carbon sink by far.
Thank you, Peter. The idea of, you use the word incinerated, to talk about the fate of these migrating birds and of course other animals, and it just breaks my heart. It's devastating. I hate to concur, but I must. The air here in New York City is already much better. So people are able to get out and about. That's probably just going to end up being one of those crazy New York moments, one of those things that happened rather than the learning moment for us all that it should be. Now, I'm not going to say that some people won't use this and take this as a learning moment, but for the masses, I don't see that happening. And I think a lot of people are just in the somnambulant state. It's fine. Someone's taking care of it. There's this belief that those people up there, the higher ups or whatever, the demigods, our politicians, will take care of it and make sure everything's okay. No one's taking care of the situation. I shouldn't say no one, but let's just say very few people are able to grasp the scope of the specter of climate change, and those who are able to don't have the power, as you mentioned, that say the fossil fuel industries have. So it's a pretty big mess, and we should not allow ourselves to be lulled into the sense of safety that someone else is going to come along and take care of us. Hate to say it, but in this situation, it's just not how it is. What do you think, Paul?
So we seem to have crossed some sort of threshold in terms of the intensity, or severity, the size, the number of acres burned or number of hectares burned, the speed at which the fires transfer, across roads, and basically the temperatures at which they're burning. We seem to have crossed a global threshold or be very close to one. And the problem is with the forest burning is it's a double whammy, of course, because you release huge amounts of CO2, in a short period of time, whether it be a few weeks or a month when the fires are burning. But you also lose the carbon sink for a much longer period of time, for the next decade or so. And if the climate has changed in the region, then the forests aren't going to grow back. You'll get grasslands or savanna growing back. And this is a big concern for large parts of the Amazon rainforest when there's massive fires there. So we seem to be in a new wildfire regime, certainly in the boreal forests of northern Canada, and also, across the globe in Siberia, as Peter's talked about. And most of the trees up in those regions are coniferous trees, they're fir trees. And when they dry out, they have all these saps and oils, and they can burn much more explosively than deciduous trees, hardwood forests, at lower latitudes. Looking at some of the fires, first of all, the New York City was unbelievable, the amount of the density of the smoke, the yellow and orange of the sky, and how quickly it developed. So it was pretty clear at 11 in the morning, started getting hazy, and by 2 p.m. you couldn't see anything. It was completely socked out with the orange haze. So that's 3 hours. It's very useful to look at time lapses. There some of the major media organizations have published, they've linked to the video and shown these still images of the time lapse. And this is sort of what happens. The interesting thing is like, we didn't have that type of orange sky in Ottawa. It was nowhere near as bad. We're much closer to the fire source. So the winds can actually concentrate the smoke from a wide area into a very narrow area. And this exactly is what happened over New York City to make it apocalyptic. Now, a few years ago, Australia had massive wildfires, which killed, 1 billion, 2 billion animals. A few years ago, Paradise, California burned to the ground. And I should point out, I mentioned the lightning. Lightning, about half the fires are started by lightning, the other half by humans. The human one includes arsonists, which is very, very rare, I should point out. It's mostly cigarettes thrown out of cars. It's campfires not put out properly. It's sparks. So like a train running along steel rail can generate sparks. And that actually triggered the fire that destroyed the town of Lytton, BC a few years ago, in combination with the 50-degree-Celsius temperatures. The Paradise, California was high winds knocked over power lines, and those power lines started those fires, which then incinerated Paradise, California. There's also the exhaust pipe on your internal combustion engine car is very, very hot, and it can set leaves on fire. Leaves can be sucked up underneath the car while it's running, and it can start fires that way. So there's all of these things, and we can't forget Fort McMurray, the heart of Canada's oil sands, tar sands, because that town had huge fires back in 2016 that burned hotter than anything seen before. And did we do much? Have we done much since any of those events have occurred? Not really. California's had massive fires causing these orange type skies for quite a while, but this is quite a new thing to the major eastern coast cities. So we'll see what happened. I think action on the Dust Bowl in the 30s only happened when the dust made it to Washington and closed down parts of the political system. So they said, well, we've got to take action, right? So now, we've had smoke blanketing Washington, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. So, major tens to hundreds of millions of people. So yeah, it's just going to get worse in the future. Canada has a heck of a lot of forests, and this is only a small fraction of them that have burned thus far. I guess you got to look on the bright side. Once it burns, it won't burn again for a decade or two.
Well, that's an interesting way to look at it, Paul. I guess we have to look for a bright side. And of course, if there's not much left to burn, yeah, I guess the bright side is it won't be burning anytime soon. Peter, you're in BC, which it's always been my dream to visit there. It looks so majestic and beautiful. And I'm wondering, do you have any idea how this will change your province in the future?
Of course, we've had record fires in British Columbia. Those fires have been studied and attributed to global warming, to emissions, and that is to mainly fossil fuel emissions. So we're getting, it should have been painfully obvious decades ago. We didn't need models to know that if we warmed the surface of the planet, if we heated up the surface of the planet, we will get more heat waves faster and worse. We would get more forest fires. They would be worse. They'd last longer. They'd be more intense. This has also been, of course, projected by the models. I don't think we needed models to know what was going to happen. So we're looking at 30 years of worse than inaction on climate change. We're looking at 30 years of our governments and corporations stoking increasing global warming and climate change. So the question arises, I'm looking at these maps. So I'm looking at the climate reanalyzer maps, which are great. They show in dramatic colors where the world is heating up fastest. I'm looking at it now. It's heating up fastest in the Canadian Boreal. It's heating up fastest in the central Siberian Boreal. And I could lay over those maps the huge, vast fires burning in the Canadian Boreal and in the Siberian Boreal. Now, we cannot afford to lose these carbon sinks. We're losing the tropical forest Amazon carbon sinks very, very fast. They're soaking up little carbon at all. So our land carbon sink is now the boreal forest. If we lose that, we are finished. Humanity, civilization, most life on the planet. And what's it going to take? So I'll ask, what is it going to take for the politicians, etc., to do it? Well, I am convinced they're going to carry on burning fossil fuels on an agenda that they're going to burn to the last drop. So the question is, what is it going to take for the people to rise up in the world and say, we've had enough. We know this is going to get worse, and to rise up, and rebellion is no longer enough. There has to be a revolution against this. This is a situation we can't just look back and watch it, horrified though we are, get worse and worse and worse and consume more and more and more of our planet. We have methane feedback with atmospheric methane skyrocketing from wetlands, including the wetlands in the Boreal. Science has asserted this. We've got atmospheric CO2 spiking up about 50% faster than it has been normally in just the past month. We're in big, big, deep trouble. And the future, our future, is in terrible trouble.
Thank you, Peter. Our future is in terrible trouble. Our present is in terrible trouble. I agree, rebellion isn't enough. It's very unfortunate that we seem to have a society, at least from what I can see, of people who have addiction to technology, which is very distracting and allows people to focus on things of little relevance while the world burns. To our dear audience out there, I am very, very grateful, and I know that I speak for all of us, that you are here, that you care, and that this is important to you, because we need people who care about what's going on in our world and on our planet. Without that, as Peter says, we are doomed. Now, I have to bring up one thing you can do, and that is Those of you who still enjoy eating meat, especially red meat, I'm not going to make any judgments. I do want to say that if you make a switch from the red meat to an Impossible Burger once in a while, or if you completely replaced cow meat for Impossible Burger or Beyond Burger, for those of you who feel as though there's nothing you can do, it's a very little ask, and it, might I add, it will drastically increase your health. So we like to close on some bit of positivity. This is something that you can do right here and now to help. And of course, share that message with a friend. For those of you who have had experience with the bad air due to these terribly tragic forest fires, please share your experience below, as we have shared and as I have shared mine in New York City. Let us know how this has affected you. We'd really like to hear your experience. And we thank you once again for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next time with the Climate Emergency Forum.